Right, in this video we're going to change a tyre on a Mantis scooter. This will be the same if you're doing a puncture as well to get to the inner tube. So all you need is an 18mm socket, or you can use a spanner, a 4mm Allen key and a 3mm. So the first thing is worth as well putting the scooter on a block like that, just so you're off the floor. So we're firstly going to loosen off the wheel. These are on pretty tight. These things just lock the wheel into place, so they do need some prizing off to remove the wheel. And this is quite an involving job, so you do need to be relatively handy with a spanner to be able to do this. As well, ideally you want to remove these little 3mm which hold the front brake on, because behind here is the cable for the front motor. I forgot to mention as well, you need a rubber mallet ideally, because the amount of torque going through these axles, the axle does like to sort of sit. There we are. And once the wheel's out, you don't have that much room to work with because of the cable going to the motor. But the bolts you need are on the other side. Let out the air, otherwise you get a puncture. Right, so once you've firstly removed the pressure out of the tyre, very important, then you can loosen these fully. It's worth noting as well, try not to pull the tyre too much, because you don't want to stress out that motor cable, because I can imagine that's relatively difficult to replace. I think there's 6 of these bolts. Right, now that all these are off, you can remove the tyre and its sort of holder thing. And just watch the motor doesn't drop onto the ground. So the inner tube and tyre sits on the rim like this. And what you've got to make sure when you're putting the inner tube and tyre back on is that all the air is out of the tube. Otherwise, when these two pieces slot together, you can pinch the inner tube. But if it's all the air has been removed, you shouldn't have that issue. So you can literally just pull that piece off and then remove the tube. You can patch these, but it's always worth just putting a new inner tube in. So here's the new tyre we're fitting. And what you want to make sure is that the right direction is on. So it'll say the rotation on the sidewall somewhere here. The valve needs to be opposite the disc, like that. Right, so once it's in like that, you can double check that the rotation is correct. And yeah, it is now. And then just slot on the half of the rim. It is relatively tricky to pop it on, but it's not too bad. And then, like I said earlier, just make sure that the valve is nicely sat in there. Which currently it isn't, but if you just rotate it around, just make sure the valve is sitting in there quite nicely. So at the moment it's on a bit of an angle. You just want to make sure it's not like that and that it's nice and straight like that, so then there'll be no stress on that valve. And then just make sure there's no air in there, just so we don't pinch the tyre now. This part's pretty tricky because ideally you don't want to be touching the disc, because if you've got dirty hands you could contaminate the disc. There is a slot in the wheel here. Now it's pretty easy to miss. The valve needs to go in here. So yeah, the valve is there. You need to line it up like that. Now it's worth tightening up the bolts, so opposite bolts again. So if you start with one and just tighten it partially. If you start with 2 bolts, get them down relatively snug, just so the tube isn't going to be poking through the split rim. And you don't have to do these bolts up that tight. Once you've done all the bolts up, if you just go around and just torque them, how tight they should be. Then you don't want to do these really tight, just enough.
Right, so they're all nice and tight.
we'll pump it up now. It just uses standard bike Schrader valve, or like what you got on a car. Yeah, if you check the pressure on the sidewall, these go to a maximum of 50. So we're going to do 40 psi, because they're quite a high volume tyre. As well, you can just visually inspect that the tyre is seating correctly, which it looks pretty good in this case. So now, just so you can see, the way they route this electric cable is so the slots in the axle obviously line up with the dropouts, but the electrical cable sits underneath, so the cable runs from the bottom back. So if you slide these axles in like this, they are pretty tricky to do. As well, if you just make sure that the electrical cable sits back into the little groove up there, and then that's the reason why we removed this brake caliper, because this part sits behind it like that, just to hold in that electrical cable out of the way. So these little washers then slot over the axle and slot in there. And again, it's an 18mm socket here. It's probably best if you've got a ratchet to use that. Again, it's worth tightening the bolts like evenly on either side before you tighten them for good. And they don't have to be mega tight. Then you just refit this brake and brake mount. These bolts are only a 3mm, so they're quite easy to round. So just be careful when you're tightening these. And again, try and tighten them evenly, either side, before you fully torque them down. Again, because these are only a 3mm, you don't want to do them very tight. Just snug them up. And that's it.